The name Benito Mussolini stirs memories of a regime that promised greatness but left a legacy of ruin and terror. Known as Il Duce, or the leader, Mussolini painted himself as Italy's savior, a man destined to restore the grandeur of ancient Rome. But behind this facade lay a ruler who suppressed freedom, spread fear, and plunged his nation into darkness. Imagine a country gripped by propaganda, where speaking out could mean imprisonment or death. Mussolini didn't just lead Italy, he controlled it, bending its institutions, economy, and people to his will. From orchestrating mass violence against his political rivals to fueling a war that devastated millions, Mussolini's reign marked one of the darkest chapters in modern Italian history. Born in 1883 to a blacksmith and a schoolteacher, Mussolini's early life was a mix of rebellion and ambition. As a young man, he admired socialist ideals and became a fiery speaker, advocating for workers' rights. But his appetite for power couldn't be confined to one ideology. After being expelled from the Socialist Party for supporting World War I, Mussolini founded a new political movement: fascism. The post-war years in Italy were chaotic. Economic depression, unemployment, and a disillusioned populace created fertile ground for Mussolini's rise. In 1919, he formed the Fasci di Combattimento, a paramilitary group that used violence and intimidation to spread his ideology. His followers, known as Black Shirts, wreaked havoc on streets, targeting socialists, unionists, and anyone who opposed fascism. By 1922, Mussolini saw his opportunity. Italy's government was weak, and fear of a communist revolution loomed large. With his Black Shirts marching on Rome, Mussolini demanded power. King Victor Emmanuel III, seeking to avoid civil war, capitulated and appointed him prime minister. But Mussolini didn't settle for just leadership. He wanted total control. Within a few years, Mussolini dismantled democracy in Italy. He banned opposition parties, censored the press, and established a one-party state. Declaring himself Il Duce, he cast Italy as a resurrected Roman Empire, promising glory and dominance on the world stage. However, these promises came with a price: a nation under siege from its own leader. Once Benito Mussolini consolidated power, his first and most pressing task was to eliminate dissent. A ruler obsessed with control, Mussolini saw opposition as a threat that needed to be eradicated swiftly and ruthlessly. To achieve this, he constructed a police state, turning Italy into a nation where fear reigned supreme. At the heart of Mussolini's crackdown were the Black Shirts, his loyal paramilitary force. They patrolled the streets like an unrestrained army, brutally assaulting political opponents, unionists, and even civilians suspected of disloyalty. Kidnappings, public beatings, and murders became common tools of intimidation. Mussolini ensured that resistance wasn't just punished, it was humiliated, with many victims paraded through towns as warnings to others. The regime's control didn't stop at physical violence. Mussolini also targeted free thought. The Italian press, once a vibrant and diverse platform, was suffocated by censorship. Only state-approved propaganda was allowed, glorifying Mussolini and portraying fascism as Italy's salvation. Writers, intellectuals, and artists who resisted this narrative were arrested or forced into exile. Schools and universities became instruments of indoctrination, where students were taught that Mussolini was infallible and opposition was treasonous. Mussolini also used legal frameworks to suppress dissent. In 1926, the exceptional decrees granted him extraordinary powers to dissolve political parties and imprison individuals without trial. Thousands were sent to remote islands like Lipari and Ponza, where they endured harsh conditions as political prisoners. These measures weren't about justice. They were about silencing voices that questioned his authority. For Mussolini, control wasn't just about ruling. It was about creating a climate of submission. Italians learned to watch their words, their actions, and even their thoughts. Spies were everywhere. Neighbors, colleagues, and even family members could report acts of disloyalty. This web of fear ensured that opposition was not only silenced but erased, leaving Mussolini's voice as the only one that mattered. Mussolini's ambitions extended far beyond Italy's borders. Obsessed with restoring the glory of the Roman Empire, he set his sights on Ethiopia, one of the few remaining independent nations in Africa. What followed was a campaign of unparalleled brutality, a war that showcased the depths of Mussolini's ruthlessness. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia under the pretense of a border dispute, but the real motive was imperial conquest. Mussolini sought to cement his legacy as a modern-day Caesar, carving out a colonial empire that would bolster his regime's prestige. The Italian military, equipped with advanced weaponry and air power, faced a poorly armed Ethiopian resistance. Despite this imbalance, Mussolini authorized the use of chemical weapons, including mustard gas, in clear violation of international law. Entire villages were bombed into oblivion, their populations annihilated. Civilians, including women and children, were targeted indiscriminately. The Red Terror, a campaign of mass executions, torture, and forced labor, was unleashed to suppress any resistance. Prisoners of war were subjected to unspeakable horrors, often executed en masse or sent to labor camps where survival was nearly impossible. The human toll of Mussolini's Ethiopian campaign was staggering. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians lost their lives, while countless others were displaced. The land, once fertile and vibrant, was scarred by chemical attacks that poisoned water supplies and crops. Yet Mussolini proudly declared victory, parading Ethiopia's conquest as proof of fascism's strength. While the League of Nations condemned Italy's actions, it failed to take decisive action. This emboldened Mussolini, who saw the international community's inactions as a green light for further aggression. For the Ethiopian people, however, the scars of Mussolini's ambitions ran deep, serving as a grim reminder of the cost of unchecked power. Benito Mussolini's regime became even darker when he allied with Adolf Hitler, forming the Pact of Steel in 1939. This alliance between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany marked the beginning of Mussolini's descent into even more destructive policies, as he followed Hitler's lead into an era of genocidal actions and global conflict. At first, Mussolini considered himself superior to Hitler, dismissing the German leader as an upstart. But as Hitler's power grew and his militaristic policies turned Germany into a formidable force, Mussolini saw an opportunity to bolster his own standing by aligning with him. This decision would have catastrophic consequences for Italy and its people. Under Hitler's influence, Mussolini adopted anti-Semitic policies, which had not been a cornerstone of fascism before this alliance. In 1938, the Italian government enacted the Italian racial laws, which banned Jews from public life. Jewish children were expelled from schools, professionals were barred from practicing, and businesses were confiscated. While Mussolini initially implemented these policies with reluctance, his regime became complicit in the deportation of Italian Jews to Nazi concentration camps. The military implications of the Pact of Steel were equally disastrous. Mussolini, eager to showcase Italy as a great power, committed his forces to Hitler's war plans despite the unpreparedness of the Italian military. The alliance dragged Italy into World War II, leading to humiliating defeats in Greece, North Africa, and the Soviet Union. Mussolini's reckless pursuit of imperial glory left Italian soldiers ill-equipped and demoralized, resulting in massive casualties. The Pact of Steel didn't just cement Mussolini's alliance with Hitler, it tied Italy's fate to the Nazi regime. As the war progressed and the Axis powers faced defeat, Mussolini's dream of dominance unraveled. The alliance, born out of a quest for power, ultimately became a chain. One of Mussolini's most diabolical achievements was his mastery of propaganda and indoctrination, turning fascism into a religion and himself into its godlike figure. Mussolini understood the power of narrative, crafting an image of himself as a savior who could restore Italy's glory. To achieve this, he controlled every aspect of communication and culture. The press was one of Mussolini's first targets. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and cinema became tools to glorify fascism. The regime established the Ministry of Popular Culture, which dictated the content of media, ensuring that only state-approved messages reached the public. Journalists who refused to comply were silenced, exiled, or killed. Italians were bombarded with images of Mussolini leading troops, working in fields, and speaking to a adoring crowd always presented as strong, decisive, and omnipresent. Education became another pillar of Mussolini's propaganda machine. Schools were transformed into factories of fascist ideology, where children were taught to idolize Mussolini and view dissent as betrayal. Textbooks glorified Italy's history, emphasizing its Roman roots and downplaying its modern struggles. Teachers who refused to conform were dismissed, and youth organizations like the Opera Nazionale Ballia ensured that fascist ideals were instilled outside the classroom. Even the arts and sports were not spared. Mussolini promoted cultural programs that celebrated fascism, commissioning grand architectural projects to symbolize the regime's strength. Sporting events became showcases of Italian superiority with Mussolini using victories to project image of unity. This relentless indoctrination ensured that Mussolini's grip on the nation extended beyond politics. By controlling the minds of his people, he created a society that revered him as a messianic figure while suppressing critical thinking. The result was a populace conditioned to accept tyranny as destiny, a chilling reminder of the power of propaganda. Mussolini's promises of economic revival came at a steep price for Italy's workers and peasants. While his regime claimed to champion the common man, the reality was a system built on exploitation, inequality, and suffering. One of Mussolini's signature projects was the draining of the Pontine Marshes, a massive public works initiative aimed at showcasing fascism's ability to transform the nation. While this project was touted as a triumph, it relied on the forced labor of thousands of workers, many of whom endured grueling conditions for meager pay. The marshes were transformed into farmland, but the benefits were unevenly distributed, with much of the land going to Mussolini's supporters rather than the impoverished farmers who needed it most. Industrial workers fared no better. Mussolini's corporate state was designed to suppress labor rights, favoring employers over employees. Strikes were banned, and unions were brought under state control, rendering them powerless to advocate for workers. Wages stagnated while the cost of living rose, leaving many Italians struggling to survive. Those who protested faced swift and brutal retribution, often at the hands of the black shirts. Rural peasants, who made up a significant portion of Italy's population, were similarly oppressed. Mussolini's policies prioritized large landowners, neglecting the needs of small farmers. Many were forced to work in conditions reminiscent of feudalism, with little hope of upward mobility. Mussolini's rhetoric of a united and prosperous Italy was a cruel irony for those who bore the brunt of his economic policies. While Mussolini claimed to be a man of the people, his actions told a different story. By exploiting workers and peasants, he ensured that his regime thrived at the expense of the very individuals it claimed to serve. Mussolini's decision to align with Nazi Germany and enter World War II turned his reign into a catastrophic period for Italy. His ambition to restore Italy's dominance on the global stage blinded him to the harsh realities of the nation's unpreparedness for war. What followed was a series of humiliations and tragedies that not only devastated Italy, but also exposed Mussolini's incompetence as a leader. When Mussolini declared war on France and Britain in 1940, he believed the conflict would be short-lived, with Italy gaining easy victories and territorial expansion. However, Italy's military was woefully unprepared. Soldiers lacked modern equipment, training, and even basic supplies. The Italian Navy, once a source of pride, was unable to compete with Allied forces, and the Air Force was outclassed by modern aircraft. Mussolini's campaigns in North Africa, Greece, and the Soviet Union ended in disaster. The invasion of Greece in 1940, launched without proper planning, resulted in a humiliating defeat that required German intervention. In North Africa, Italian forces were overwhelmed by Allied troops, leading to the loss of crucial territories. Mussolini's decision to send Italian soldiers to the Eastern Front further stretched the already struggling military, resulting in thousands of deaths in brutal winter conditions. As the war dragged on, Italy's civilian population bore the brunt of Mussolini's miscalculations. Bombings destroyed cities, disrupted supply chains, and left millions homeless. Food shortages and inflation created widespread suffering, and morale plummeted as Italians realized the promises of fascist glory were hollow. Resistance movements grew, fueled by disillusionment with Mussolini's regime. By 1943, Italy was on the verge of collapse. The Allied invasion of Sicily and the relentless bombing of Italian cities forced King Victor Emmanuel III to act. Mussolini was arrested and removed from power, marking the beginning of the end for fascism. However, his legacy of destruction would linger, as Italy struggled to recover from the war's devastating impact. Mussolini's downfall was as dramatic as his rise to power. By 1943, his regime was crumbling under the weight of military failures, economic collapse, and widespread opposition. The man who once declared himself Il Duce found himself abandoned by allies, despised by his people, and hunted by his enemies. After his removal from power in July 1943, Mussolini was imprisoned on the remote island of Ponza. However, Hitler, unwilling to lose his Italian ally, orchestrated a daring rescue. German paratroopers freed Mussolini and installed him as the leader of a puppet state in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic. Despite this lifeline, Mussolini power was a shadow of itself. He was little more than a figurehead, dependent on Nazi support to maintain control. As the Allies advanced through Italy, resistance against Mussolini grew. Partisan groups, determined to rid Italy of fascism, waged guerrilla warfare against his forces. By 1945, the tide had turned completely. Realizing the war was lost, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland with his mistress, Clara Petacci. Disguised as a German soldier, he was captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were executed by firing squad. Their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down in a public square, where crowds gathered to mock and defile them. This gruesome display marked the definitive end of Mussolini's reign and served as a symbolic rejection of fascism. Mussolini's final days were marked by betrayal and humiliation, a stark contrast to the power and control he once wielded. The reign of Benito Mussolini stands as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and authoritarianism. His diabolical actions not only plunged Italy into decades of suffering, but also contributed to the broader devastation of World War II. The scars of his rule are etched into the history of Italy and the world. Mussolini's legacy is one of deception. He rose to power by exploiting Italy's economic and political instability, presenting himself as a savior while dismantling democracy and instituting a regime of fear. His use of propaganda and indoctrination created a society that worshipped fascism, even as it eroded the freedoms and dignity of its people. The cost of Mussolini's ambitions was staggering. His imperial campaigns in Ethiopia and his involvement in World War II caused immense human suffering, from the chemical attacks on civilians to the senseless deaths of Italian soldiers. His alliance with Hitler tied Italy to one of history's most notorious genocides, leaving an indelible stain on the nation's history. Today, Mussolini's regime serves as a case study in the dangers of authoritarian rule. His rise was facilitated by a populace desperate for change, willing to trade liberty for promises of security and glory. His fall was a testament to the resilience of those who resisted, refusing to let tyranny define their nation's future. The story of Mussolini is not just an Italian tragedy. It is a global warning. It reminds us that the allure of strongman leadership can mask the seeds of oppression, and that the cost of ignoring history's lessons can be devastating. Mussolini's reign may have ended in 1945, but its lessons remain as relevant today as ever.